Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News, produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague, Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some of the news stories which will be coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Amelia. Hello, everyone. Yes, my name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and we've got some interesting stories to cover this week. Quite a few ones coming out from British government and Parliament, so some interesting issues to cover there. So, yeah, I will pass over to Amelia to take us through the first story.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story this week is looking at a new Brexit freedoms bill, which has been brought forward by Prime Minister Boris Johnson to mark the 2-year anniversary of getting Brexit done. And so a major government drive will aim to cut £1 billion of red tape for businesses and improve regulations. So the bill will effectively make it easier to amend or remove outdated retained EU law, which has been kind of kept on since we've left the EU. And so this change will aim to reform and repeal and replace the outdated laws. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue with this one.
Thank you, Amelia. Yes, so the interesting part of this Brexit freedoms bill is that it included reference to potentially changing Britain's laws on data protection and AI, or certainly diverging from the European Union. Now, the EU is looking at an AI bill, and it's never really been envisaged that the UK would follow the act that the EU is looking to put together. But data protection is, of course, a different matter. The UK has an adequacy agreement with the European Commission, whereby the European Commission says that the UK's laws on data protection are sufficiently adequate, and also that the security and privacy regime in terms of things like government surveillance is also within the tolerances accepted within the European Union. So on that basis, data flows easily back and forth from the EU to the UK, and the UK has allowed adequacy to Europe. So things pretty much continue as they were before the UK left the EU single market. However, this announcement of potential divergence from GDPR, which is in effect written into UK law through the UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act 2018, could threaten the basis for that adequacy decision. So, I mean, there's two thoughts here. One is that any great degree of divergence threatens that adequacy decision. But secondly, if you want to stay within the envelope of that adequacy decision, it will commensurately reduce the amount of leeway the government might otherwise have in order to be able to argue that it could potentially move elsewhere in terms of its regime. So it will be difficult to see exactly what may or may not happen there. I wonder, is this part of a general distraction and red meat strategy by the UK government to distract from some of its other problems at the moment? It does suggest a little bit so, but we will have to see exactly on the back of this announcement what the government actually intends to do. Bear in mind that back in reality, do we have anything in the most recent Queen's speech around a new data protection law? No, we don't. So if there's actually anything going to happen on this, we'd have to watch for the next state opening of Parliament and what's in the Queen's speech. That will be an indicator as to anything actually happening.
Thanks, Peter. And continuing with the kind of theme of the government, so the government has been warned by an influential group of MPs to urgently tackle the fraud epidemic across Britain. So this is kind of surrounding the concerns about increasing financial toll on consumers and taxpayers from economic crime. So here there has been a 43% jump in fraud and computer misuse between June 2019 and June 2021, which is a huge jump. And so I'll pass over to Peter to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of this.
Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, so we know that there's been a huge rising amount of fraud affecting workplaces, affecting individuals during the course of the last 2 years during the pandemic. It's even got bad when it's come to things like the coronavirus business loans that were given out. Indeed, there was the resignation from one of the ministers in charge of that scheme, Lord Agnew, who said, despairing of the government's attitude with regards to trying to stamp out fraud in relation to the $9 billion of government support and subsidy given out to businesses. He ended up resigning, saying that he just despaired of the situation, and he resigned on his feet in the House of Lords last week. And this is kind of part of the wider malaise in government around fraud. I mean, they've said they're going to replace action fraud with a new department. We've got things like the National Cybersecurity Centre and the offensive cybersecurity capabilities of the cybersecurity force. But that isn't the same as properly supporting people who are victims of fraud. And we report enough on issues around fraud and the victims of it in this update each week. But it seems that when it comes to the government really practically doing something about it, given that the UK economy, I think more than many other economies, is more exposed to fraud through e-commerce, it really does suggest that more needs to be done and needs to be a clearer government strategy. We have the National Cybersecurity Strategy that was issued last month. However, there's really not an awful lot in there in terms of concrete, what are we going to do and how are we going to help people? And this article talks about it more broadly in terms of the concerns within government. I think this is something else where we need to see real proper grip by government and by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport to really start thinking about greater controls, greater protections in place when it comes to cyber security. So, yeah, let's see if the government do something about fraud. We know there are issues. We know the government has its Economic Crime Strategy Board, and I'm aware of some of the people that have been on there. Indeed, I've spoken to some of the people on the Economic Crime Strategy Board, but is it more than just a talking shop? We need proper guaranteed deliverable items out of this rather than just talking about how bad things are.
So including kind of within this story is there have been reforms kind of said about the company's house, which would be the registration for firms, and this would be providing tighter identity checks, which would then aim to prevent fraudsters from hiding identities behind UK businesses to launder money and conduct crime. And kind of within this, there is legislation looking to tackle fraud in the Economic Crime Bill. But however, like Peter says, it's whether this actually comes to fruition is what we're going to have to watch out for in the coming months.
That's the question.
Indeed.
So moving on to our next story. Again, we're keeping with kind of the theme of government so far. However, now we turn to the French government. So hackers from ransomware gang Lockbit 2.0 claimed to have hacked into the French Justice Ministry last week. And they were saying if the ransomware is not paid by the 10th of February, that all of the stolen data will be published. So that's a total of around 9,859 files, which will be kind of just put out there for anyone and everyone to read. The extent of the attack and kind of the nature of the documents that have been stolen are yet to be confirmed. However, this is yet another example of kind of a government entity that has been hacked, even in the last kind of couple of weeks alone. So I'll pass over to Peter for the rest of that one.
Thank you, Amelia. So there's two things we can infer from this. One, it's the Ministry of Justice, so the records are more than likely, given the volume of them, they're going to be related to people passing through the justice system. So we could be talking about criminal records, home addresses, details of crime, details of punishment, convictions, cautions, those sorts of things. By its definition, this is very sensitive personal data. So it's very embarrassing for the French government, and then we have to bear in mind that CNIL, Council National for Information, and I forget what else for, apologies to our French listeners, but CNIL is one of the more rigorous regulators when it comes to data protection breaches, so they will not shy away from potentially following up on this, investigating, and if they find there have been failings with which a loss of that amount suggests that may well have been, then it may well end up being enforcement action by CNIL against the French Ministry of Justice as a result.
It'll be interesting to see how that one develops, Peter. So we've got actually a good few hacks to talk about this week. So our next hack is the major fuel supply in Germany. They are currently operating at a limited capacity after a cyber attack disrupted IT systems over the weekend. Allegedly, the oil tanking Deutschland GmbH & Co. They transport oil and vehicles, etc., and they use companies like Shell. And they discovered they had been hacked on Saturday. They have actually declared a force majeure for the majority of the inland supply activities in Germany. So this is kind of a legal jargon term, and so effectively a force majeure excuses a company from contractor agreements when an extraordinary event occurs which is beyond its control. So I'll pass over to Peter to get into this one.
Thank you, Amelia. I think this actually shows the who knows who was behind this hack, but it almost makes you wonder, given some of the geopolitical issues taking place at the moment, and we know some of the offensive capabilities by state-sponsored and non-state-sponsored hackers domiciled within Russia. It makes you wonder if the hacking of a German fuel supply, given the sensitivities around the supply of fuel to Germany and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the pressures currently on the supply of fuel, which would of course at the moment be affected by 3 of the current fuel pipelines supplying Germany running through Ukraine, means it almost seems a very significant coincidence that at the time when political tensions are ramping up, that suddenly a large German oil producer is hit by a cyber attack. Coincidence? Well, I think you have to draw your own conclusions. But the thing is, will we see more potential attacks like this? Again, draw your own conclusions. It now is it seems to be a fact of life that significant attacks like this are not felt to be as bad as, say, an airstrike bombing an oil refinery. But to be honest, you can achieve similar numbers in terms of damage to production through an offensive cyber attack like this, until nation states sit down and decide, will there be proper sanction and penalty for attacks like this?
It'd be interesting to see, especially not to forget there was the whole Colonial Pipeline hack which occurred last year, which caused huge issues across the world for throughout the pipeline. So it's interesting that we're seeing that critical infrastructure is being targeted. On a lesser scale, our next hack this week is, again, another hack, and this is on Cakey snacks. So while this is probably not quite as important as a petrol pipeline, shops have been warned deliveries of nuts and crisps could be at risk. And I mean, we are from the UK, and nuts and crisps effectively are in everyone's lives. They've been hit by ransomware, that's Cakey snacks, and in a post on the dark net, the cyber criminals published personal documents from staff with the company letterhead. There was also a countdown timer on the page which warns more will be published unless a ransom has been paid. I'll pass over to Peter for this one.
Thanks, Amelia. I'm reminded of the line from Al Murray, the pub landlord: "Man shall not live by beer alone, he needs nuts and snacks as well." And this is being denied here. I mean, this is just showing here, though, the problem of a cyber attack that can then exacerbate existing problems. We're already aware of the issues with regards to supply chains that have been affecting the economy around the world, whereby the fact that some countries are still having restrictions as a result of coronavirus and others aren't, it's meant that sometimes it's been difficult to get supplies of anything from high-end microchips and equipment through to food and other goods onto the shelves. But it then doesn't take much, for example, a cyber attack like this to then have a massive impact on a business, and that's clearly what Cakey snacks are going to be experiencing here. You know, it's a difficult one for hospitality. They've had a terrible 2020 and a terrible 2021, and now they don't want to have their sales hit by the fact that people can't get the crisps and nuts they would otherwise expect in a bar. So it's showing what damage can be carried out there, it's almost like if you wanted to target a particular sector, you know, and hospitality and its suppliers like this are, as I say, very ripe for exploitation. So let's hope they're able to recover from the after effects of this as quickly as they can.
And for the sake of the nation, let's hope so too, because I don't think anyone will be able to live without their crisps and nuts for very long. So moving on to our final story today, yes again, Google and Facebook are making an appearance this week. So Google and Facebook would be forced to agree a price with newspapers for using their stories under new laws being drawn up by the government. If adopted, tech giants would be told to negotiate payment deals with news organisations in order to display their content. Should these talks collapse, arbitrators would be setting a fair price for this. So to kind of back this up, Google and Facebook took about 80% of the 14 billion spent on digital advertising in the UK in 2019, according to the CMA. National and local newspapers took less than 4%. Given that Google has more than 90% share of the search advertising market in the UK, and Facebook controls more than half of the display advertising sector, I mean, they need to be giving everyone else a fair share really here. I'll pass on to Peter to go through that.
Indeed, thanks, Amelia. So this is interesting that a similar law has already been passed in Australia with regards to the tech giants that share this, share news stories and then get all the sponsorship and advertising revenue, forcing them to pay for the content that they are then cannibalizing and sharing. Already Facebook does pay a certain amount, but it's nowhere near the sort of amounts that they're actually taking. When you say that huge slice of the £14 billion UK cake in terms of digital advertising. So this law would seek to address the balance. I don't think you can underestimate the damage that the loss of the advertising revenue has caused to the both online and print media, particularly to local news, to the point that an awful lot of, in some cases, centuries-old newspapers, certainly in the regions, are now, they've gone out of business because there simply isn't enough revenue out there to sustain interests in the publication. Whereas it's even become very, very difficult now, even for the big national newspapers, to actually make any meaningful money. Very often they are just sinkholes owned by high net worth individuals keen to have their views reinforced through the popular press. So, you know, it's in everyone's interests for journalism to be profitable and a going concern. And this law may seek to correct that. We'll have to see what happens. Again, it's one of these things that sounds like a terribly good idea, but then actually achieving it in practice in the face of what will be massive lobbying by Facebook, Google and others might be somewhat easier said than done. Bear in mind that both Facebook and Google have massive headquarters for Europe based in London, and they may then turn around and say, if you proceed with this law, we might decide to put our headquarters somewhere else, with the commensurate loss of very highly paid and highly skilled jobs, which wouldn't go down very well. So nice idea. Will it actually happen? And also it'd be interesting to see data from Australia in terms of, did it actually make any difference? And obviously you'd only get meaningful data on those sorts of things after laws like this have been in operation for more than a couple of years to see how it works. And another story where I think we have to say watch this space, but it may mean that you've got a better redress there between the aggregators, the Facebooks and the Googles, and the actual content creators themselves.
So I think it's quite interesting to note the fact that actually when this initially started in Australia, Facebook instantly said, no, you can jog on, we're not going to do it. But eventually they did in fact fold. So it'd be interesting to see their approach here, because like you say, we do have that headquarters in London, and from our kind of perspective, it does have so many high paid jobs that we do want to have in that sector. So like you say, it'd be interesting to watch how they hit back in some sort of sense from that.
Indeed, it's one thing to issue a very favourable press release saying we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but it seems to be the theme of this podcast. How do you translate that into action? And Amelia, you and I have both spent time reading through things like the National Cybersecurity Strategy, along with that Brexit Freedoms Bill, and even if you look at, it's going a little bit away from tech, but even if you look at the government's Levelling Up white paper, it all sounds very, very impressive, but where are the actual nuts and bolts to say this is what we'll end up doing? Bearing in mind, of course, the clock is always ticking. People need to see delivery rather than fine words.
Precisely, like you say, we have read so many of these different kind of bills, and the substance has very often not actually been there, despite the upwards of 100 pages that have been released. So, yes.
Full of lots of corporate civil service speak, and not really full of practical. Here is the unique difference. Here's the thing we're going to do, and how we're going to do it, and when we're going to do it, by the way, and here's the money to do it as well. Precisely,
it's a lot of speculation that we provide, but often, you know, speculation is the best we can do. So that was our last news story for today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and we'll be back next week. It's just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, and the podcast channels such as Spotify and Apple Music. And thank you for listening, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.